When a method actor's arrogance meets supernatural speed, the results aren't just humbling, they're career-ending. You're about to witness the moment when Hollywood's most technical performer learned that all his scientific analysis meant nothing against natural mastery that operated beyond human comprehension. Subscribe to discover more untold stories of when intellectual arrogance met impossible capability and got obliterated in ways that redefined everything. The silence stretched for exactly 93 seconds, longer than most movie scenes, longer than most conversations, long enough for James Coburn to realize that everything he understood about technique, method acting, and what constituted professional competence had just been obliterated by a demonstration that belonged in the realm of supernatural phenomenon rather than human achievement. At 37 years old and riding high on his reputation as Hollywood's most intellectually rigorous performer, Coburn stood motionless on the Paramount Pictures soundstage, staring at Sammy Davis Jr. with the expression of a man whose scientific approach to everything had just encountered something that violated every law of physics, biomechanics, and human capability he had spent years studying and perfecting. What had just happened on that September afternoon in 1965 wasn't just an impressive display of speed. It was the moment when Hollywood's most analytical actor discovered that authentic mastery could make his systematic methodology look like amateur fumbling, delivered by someone who never needed to analyze anything because perfection flowed from him like a natural force. Sammy Davis Jr., at 40 years old, calmly straightened his tie and looked at the devastated Coburn with an expression that mixed genuine sympathy with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had just provided the most brutal education in humility that Paramount Studios had ever witnessed. This is the untold story of the day when scientific method met supernatural ability, when intellectual arrogance encountered natural genius, and when 0.12 seconds redefined what human capability could achieve when it transcended the need for technique entirely. September 1965 at Paramount Studios represented James Coburn at the absolute peak of his intellectual arrogance and systematic approach to performance. At 37, he had earned recognition not just as a capable actor, but as someone whose method acting techniques and scientific analysis of character development had elevated him above performers who relied on intuition or natural ability rather than rigorous intellectual preparation. Coburn's approach to every role was based on comprehensive research, systematic analysis, and the kind of methodical preparation that he believed separated professional competence from amateur approximation. He studied biomechanics, analyzed psychological motivation, and approached each performance as an intellectual problem to be solved through proper research and systematic application. Which is why he was so dismissive of performers like Sammy Davis Jr., whose apparent reliance on natural ability rather than scientific methodology represented everything Coburn viewed as intellectually inferior and professionally inadequate. The confrontation began during preparation for a Western-themed variety special that would feature several major stars demonstrating different aspects of frontier skills and capabilities. Coburn had been hired specifically for his reputation as someone who brought authentic competence to Western roles through systematic preparation and scientific analysis. The problem with entertainers like Sammy, Coburn was explaining to a group of studio executives, directors, and technical advisors, is that they approach complex skills through intuition rather than systematic analysis. They might achieve adequate results for entertainment purposes, but they don't understand the underlying principles that govern optimal performance. His commentary was delivered with the authority of someone whose intellectual approach to everything had convinced him that he possessed superior understanding of how skills should be developed and applied, particularly in areas that required technical precision and systematic competence. Real marksmanship, Coburn continued, requires understanding the biomechanical principles, the physics of projectile motion, the psychology of performance under pressure. Most performers learn just enough to look convincing on camera, but they don't comprehend the scientific foundation that separates authentic capability from theatrical approximation. Sammy was nearby, reviewing choreography notes with the director, but Coburn's commentary was clearly intended to be overheard, and to establish intellectual hierarchies that placed method actors above variety entertainers in terms of authentic competence and professional sophistication. I mean, look at Sammy's approach to this material, Coburn said, raising his voice slightly to ensure his target could hear the assessment. Natural talent, yes. Entertainment value, absolutely. But when it comes to technical precision, systematic preparation, and understanding the scientific principles that govern optimal performance, we're talking about completely different levels of intellectual rigor. Sammy looked up from his notes, recognizing Coburn's deliberate provocation, and walked over to where Coburn was conducting his impromptu seminar on professional competence and intellectual superiority. "Jim," Sammy said pleasantly, "I couldn't help but overhear your analysis of systematic methodology versus intuitive approach. It sounds like you've developed quite sophisticated theoretical frameworks for skill development." Coburn smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose intellectual superiority had been properly acknowledged by a fellow performer, completely failing to recognize the subtle irony in Sammy's diplomatic language. "I have indeed," Coburn replied with obvious intellectual pride. "The thing that separates scientific approach from casual intuition is systematic analysis of all the variables that contribute to optimal performance. Most people rely on natural reflexes and hope for the best, but genuine competence requires understanding the underlying principles." Sammy nodded thoughtfully, as if receiving valuable educational information about the superiority of intellectual methodology over natural ability. "That's a fascinating perspective," Sammy said. "Very comprehensive analytical framework." He paused, maintaining his characteristic diplomatic politeness. "Though I wonder if there might be different definitions of what optimal performance actually looks like when the goal is results, rather than theoretical understanding." Coburn interpreted Sammy's response as evidence that the entertainer was interested in learning about genuine competence from someone who possessed legitimate intellectual credentials in systematic methodology. "There's really only one definition that matters from a professional standpoint," Coburn said with the confidence of someone who had never encountered capabilities that challenged his theoretical frameworks. "Consistent results achieved through systematic application of scientifically verified principles. That's what separates authentic competence from lucky accidents." Sammy's expression suggested that he found Coburn's analysis intellectually interesting, but perhaps not complete in its understanding of how mastery actually functioned. "So you're saying that authentic skill should be judged through systematic consistency rather than peak performance capability?" Sammy asked. "Exactly," Coburn confirmed. "Any performer can occasionally achieve impressive results through luck or natural reflexes. But genuine competence means being able to replicate optimal performance consistently through systematic application of proven methodology." The phrase carried clear implications about Coburn's assessment of Sammy's capabilities, that any impressive results he might achieve would represent fortunate accidents rather than authentic competence based on scientific understanding. Sammy considered Coburn's philosophy with the thoughtful attention he gave to most intellectual discussions. "That makes sense from a theoretical perspective," Sammy agreed. "Very logical framework for distinguishing between different types of capability." He maintained his pleasant expression while continuing. "Of course, that assumes that systematic methodology represents the highest level of achievement, rather than just one approach among many." Coburn looked puzzled by the suggestion that there might be approaches to competence that existed outside or beyond systematic methodology. "What do you mean?" "Well," Sammy said, "what if there are levels of mastery that transcend the need for systematic methodology entirely? What if authentic expertise means making scientific analysis irrelevant rather than applying it perfectly?" Coburn's intellectual pride engaged immediately, sensing that this conversation was moving toward territory where he could demonstrate the superiority of scientific approach through direct comparison with intuitive methodology. "Are you suggesting that casual intuition can produce results superior to systematic scientific analysis?" Coburn asked, his voice carrying the condescending tone of someone explaining obvious principles to a less intellectually sophisticated individual. "I'm suggesting we might want to test our different approaches under practical conditions," Sammy replied with characteristic diplomatic politeness. The suggestion created immediate excitement among the assembled studio personnel. who recognized that they were about to witness either a confirmation of intellectual methodology over natural ability or a discovery that would challenge fundamental assumptions about the relationship between scientific analysis and practical capability. Coburn was delighted by the prospect of demonstrating the superiority of systematic methodology in front of an audience that included several influential industry professionals and technical experts. This was exactly the kind of intellectual validation opportunity that reinforced his reputation as someone whose approach to performance was based on rigorous scientific principles rather than casual intuition. "What kind of test?" Coburn asked, though he was already confident that systematic analysis would prove superior to whatever casual approach Sammy might attempt. "Simple demonstration," Sammy said. "Since you mentioned the importance of understanding scientific principles, maybe we should see which approach produces superior practical results." Word of the impromptu challenge spread quickly through the soundstage, and within minutes a substantial crowd had gathered to witness what most assumed would be an educational demonstration of intellectual methodology proving superior to natural ability. A technical advisor appeared with specialized quickdraw equipment that had been prepared for the Western segments of the variety show. Coburn immediately began conducting a comprehensive analysis of all variables, examining equipment specifications, calculating optimal angles, and explaining the scientific principles that would govern his systematic approach. Authentic quickdraw performance requires understanding the biomechanical optimization, the physics of acceleration, and the psychological factors that affect performance under pressure. Coburn explained to the assembled observers as he conducted his systematic preparation. Most people approach this casually and hope natural reflexes will produce adequate results, but genuine competence requires scientific methodology. Sammy watched Coburn's extensive preparation with polite interest, but made no move to conduct similar analysis or optimize his equipment configuration. He remained in his characteristic relaxed posture, looking like someone attending an intellectual lecture rather than preparing to participate in serious competition. Coburn spent nearly 10 minutes adjusting his equipment, calculating optimal positioning, and explaining the scientific principles that governed his systematic approach to achieving superior performance through intellectual methodology. "The difference between scientific approach and casual intuition," Coburn continued his lecture, "is that systematic methodology produces consistent results based on proven principles, while intuitive approaches rely on unpredictable variables that can't be controlled or replicated." Sammy accepted standard equipment from the technical advisor and adjusted it with casual attention, as if he were putting on regular clothing, rather than preparing specialized equipment for competitive demonstration of different methodological approaches. "Aren't you going to analyze the biomechanical variables?" Coburn asked, noting Sammy's apparent lack of systematic preparation. "I think it'll be fine," Sammy replied, checking his watch with the same casual attention he gave to most routine activities. Coburn looked at Sammy's relaxed approach to what he considered serious intellectual competition with the expression of someone who was beginning to understand that this would be more educational than competitive. A Paramount Pictures director volunteered to oversee the demonstration, setting up professional timing equipment and establishing rules that would ensure objective measurement of systematic methodology versus intuitive approach. "Standard quickdraw," the director announced. "Scientific analysis against natural intuition. We'll see which approach produces superior practical results." "Ready?" the director called. Coburn took his scientifically calculated stance, every element positioned according to biomechanical principles and systematic analysis. His preparation represented years of intellectual study applied to achieve optimal performance through scientific methodology. Sammy remained in his characteristic casual posture, showing no signs of systematic analysis or scientific preparation. His approach suggested someone who was participating in a friendly demonstration rather than serious intellectual competition. "Draw," the director commanded. What happened next created one of the most talked-about moments in Paramount Pictures history and established a new understanding of what authentic mastery looked like when it operated beyond the boundaries of systematic methodology and entered territory that challenged fundamental assumptions about human capability. Coburn's draw was scientifically perfect, systematically executed, and intellectually impressive. His speed of 0.18 seconds demonstrated everything that rigorous analysis and systematic methodology could achieve when applied by someone with genuine commitment to intellectual excellence. But Sammy Davis Jr. had already drawn, aimed, fired, and holstered his weapon while lighting a cigarette with his free hand, all in 0.12 seconds that belonged in the realm of supernatural capability rather than human achievement, accomplished with such casual precision that he appeared to be demonstrating a natural reflex rather than executing a learned skill. Coburn stood frozen, his weapon only partially drawn, staring at Sammy with the expression of someone whose scientific worldview had just been obliterated by evidence that mastery could transcend methodology entirely and operate according to principles that exceeded intellectual understanding. The assembled crowd remained silent for 93 seconds, trying to process what they had witnessed. Several technical advisors actually checked their timing equipment multiple times, thinking the measurements had to be incorrect. Coburn was the first to speak, and his words carried the bewilderment of someone whose intellectual framework had just encountered something that challenged every scientific principle he understood. "That's not possible according to biomechanical analysis," Coburn said, his voice rising toward academic desperation. "The neural transmission speeds, the muscle response times, the mechanical constraints, none of that supports what I just witnessed." Sammy took a contemplative drag from his freshly lit cigarette and looked at Coburn with the patient expression of someone who had just provided a lesson in the difference between intellectual understanding and authentic mastery. "Different approach," Sammy said with his characteristic understatement. But Coburn's analytical mind was struggling to process the implications of what had happened from both scientific and intellectual perspectives. "Show me that again," Coburn demanded, his scientific curiosity overwhelming his personal devastation. "I need to understand the methodology you're applying." The second demonstration was even more impossible. 0.11 seconds of precision that exceeded anything in scientific literature, accomplished while Sammy maintained casual conversation with the director about scheduling for the following day. Coburn attempted his own follow-up draw, applying maximum systematic analysis and scientific methodology. But the more intensely he focused on intellectual optimization, the more his performance deteriorated rather than improved. "I don't understand," Coburn said finally, his voice carrying the confusion of someone whose scientific expertise had been revealed as irrelevant to authentic mastery. "Everything I know about biomechanics, physics, and systematic optimization says that what you're doing shouldn't be achievable." Sammy's explanation revealed not just superior capability, but access to mastery that existed outside Coburn's entire intellectual framework for understanding skill development and human performance. "Jim, you've approached marksmanship like a scientist," Sammy said, his tone carrying genuine respect for Coburn's intellectual efforts. "You've analyzed every variable, understood every principle, and developed systematic methodology for achieving optimal results. That's impressive intellectual work." He gestured toward Coburn's scientifically configured equipment and systematic approach. "But I approached marksmanship like breathing, not by understanding how it works, but by making it so natural that understanding becomes unnecessary." Coburn listened with the fascination of someone discovering that his area of intellectual expertise contained dimensions that existed beyond scientific analysis entirely. "When capability becomes natural enough," Sammy continued, "intellectual methodology actually becomes counterproductive. The skill operates best when it's allowed to function automatically, rather than when it's controlled through systematic analysis." The explanation was philosophically devastating for Coburn, who was beginning to understand that his scientific approach represented not advancement but limitation, compared to mastery that transcended intellectual methodology entirely. "You're saying that my scientific analysis actually interferes with optimal performance?" Coburn asked, his voice carrying the horror of someone whose intellectual life's work had just been revealed as fundamentally counterproductive. "I'm saying that different levels of mastery require different approaches," Sammy replied diplomatically. "But the highest levels might be about transcending methodology rather than perfecting it." Coburn stood quietly for several minutes, trying to process the implications of what he had witnessed and learned. His reputation as Hollywood's most intellectually rigorous performer had just encountered evidence that intellectual rigor might represent limitations rather than advantages when it came to authentic mastery. The conversation that followed revealed the depth of Coburn's intellectual crisis and his struggle to understand how everything he had believed about systematic methodology and scientific analysis could have been so fundamentally incomplete. "Sammy," Coburn said finally, his voice carrying a humility that was completely uncharacteristic for Hollywood's most intellectually confident performer. "Yeah, Jim? I think I need to reconsider what intellectual rigor actually means," Coburn said. "Because what you just demonstrated suggests that authentic mastery operates beyond scientific analysis entirely." Sammy accepted the acknowledgement with characteristic grace. "Different approaches work for different people, Jim. Scientific methodology produces genuine understanding and real results. It's just that some capabilities might require moving beyond understanding into more natural territory." But Coburn's intellectual ego was struggling to accommodate the revelation that his celebrated analytical approach represented intermediate-level methodology compared to mastery that transcended intellectual frameworks entirely. The psychological impact of having his scientific worldview so completely challenged created a crisis that would influence his approach to performance for the rest of his career. Over the following years, Coburn's approach to his roles became notably less analytical and more intuitive. Industry insiders observed that his encounter with Sammy had taught him the limitations of intellectual methodology when it came to authentic mastery. "Jim was never quite the same after that day," noted one veteran Hollywood observer. "He was still intelligent, still methodical, still professional. But he stopped believing that scientific analysis was the highest form of competence, and that actually made his performances more natural." The incident became legendary among entertainment professionals as an example of how authentic mastery could transcend intellectual methodology without diminishing the value of scientific analysis for those still developing their capabilities. Years later, when Coburn was asked about the most important lesson of his career, he would often reference that afternoon at Paramount as the day he learned the difference between understanding mastery and achieving mastery. "Sammy taught me that the highest level of competence is about transcending the need for competence," Coburn explained during an interview in the 1970s. "I had been trying to perfect my analytical approach to everything, but he showed me that real mastery makes analysis irrelevant." The 0.12 seconds had lasted only an instant, but the intellectual humility it created would last for decades, proving that sometimes the most valuable education comes from having your scientific certainties challenged by someone whose mastery operates according to principles that exceed human understanding. And in Hollywood, where intellectual pretension was often more valued than authentic capability, Coburn's willingness to acknowledge superior mastery and learn from it actually enhanced his reputation as a thoughtful performer, rather than damaging his credibility as an analytical actor. James Coburn had entered that soundstage as Hollywood's most scientifically rigorous performer, but he left understanding that real mastery wasn't about perfecting intellectual methodology. It was about developing such natural capability that intellectual frameworks became irrelevant to authentic achievement.